Welcome to this online lesson on the nature of warfare in the Middle Ages. This will serve as an introduction to the warfare topic. Why was warfare limited in the 13th century? The aims today are to know the meaning of limited warfare, to explain how armies were raised, and to apply knowledge to an exam question. First of all, you might want to have a go at this do now task. Study this artist's impression of the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215. It's fairly accurately reproduced. Firstly, what weapons can you see in use? Secondly, what other tactics can you see being employed? And thirdly, as a challenge, despite this hectic scene, what might be meant by limited warfare? Have a go now and pause the video. Ready to move on? Well, in the picture you might have noticed that there are bowmen or archers, there are crossbows being shot as well. There is a large catapult towards the back, that's actually called a trebuchet, which works with a counterweight. And you might notice that the defenders are also raining down arrows as well. Notice that the king in the foreground, he's the one wearing the red tabard and the crown, has got a sword, and soldiers are also armed with spears and shields as well. So, the tactics being employed are typical of a siege assault of this period. Notice that the wall has been collapsed, as has part of the tower. Notice the glowing of the fire. This is likely to have come from a mine, and in fact we know in the case of Rochester Castle it was a mine. King John, who was fighting the rebels who were holed up in the castle, had ordered the fat of 40 pigs of the least good for eating to be smeared on props placed in a mine underneath the tower of Rochester Castle. When this fat was set alight, the props collapsed, and so did the castle. But believe it or not, it still held out for another 2 days afterwards. This is a very hectic scene, but what might it be meant by limited? Well, if you were thinking that a scene like this might be rare, you would be right, and that's one crucial aspect of what is meant by limited warfare. But we're going to investigate that a little bit more in the next sections. In Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today are war, an armed conflict between two or more sides, and battle, one specific fight in a larger war. You might wonder why I've included those two quite basic keywords to begin with, but you'd be amazed how often I have very able students saying to me that there was a war between King Harold and Duke William at Hastings. Well, no, that was actually a battle. A war typically consists of more battles than simply one, whereas one battle might be one aspect of a particular war, but might not actually decide the overall course of the war in its totality. So it is important to know the distinction between the words war and battle. Thirdly, limited warfare. We're going to be focusing on this in greater detail in the next section, but in simple terms, this is a term that means all-out warfare was rare. War affected limited numbers of people at limited times. If your understanding of war is perhaps based upon things like the Second World War, where all civilians and all soldiers were affected by the war all of the time, medieval warfare was very rarely like this. Tactics. These are short-term plans and techniques for fighting. For example, within a battle. Tactical plans might be another way of putting it. For example, hitting your enemy in his flanks or in his sides is a tactic within battle. On the other hand, strategy. These are long-term overall plans, often involving months of preparation, possibly even years. These are known as your strategic aims. For example, if you wanted to cut off your enemy's route of supply, that would be a strategic aim which would limit his effectiveness in the long run. Your tasks then. Give your own definition of limited warfare and define the other key terms. And then explain the difference between tactics and strategy. As ever, if you would find it useful to note down any of these other key terms, do so as well. Pause the video now, and then press play when you're ready to move on. Done? In the next section, we're going to have a look at limited warfare in greater detail. Now we're going to have a look at features of limited warfare in the Middle Ages. I'm going to present this as a mind map. What you can do is you can watch this presentation and make notes of your own, or you might want to pause it at various stages and make a mind map of your own as well. Remember that most effective mind maps have little illustrations, like the soldier I've got on here, and are also colour-coded. This mind map is going to have 4 sections. Money, fighting, raising armies, and civilians. Let's have a look at what aspects of these features made warfare limited in the Middle Ages. Firstly, money. War was expensive. It was one of the most expensive things that a king had to undertake. And usually taxes were raised in order to pay for wars. These taxes were often very unpopular and could cause rebellions in their own right, and so they were reasonably rare, and they were only really raised when a king saw that it was necessary. Secondly, soldiers were rarely paid. They more often fought because they had little choice other than to fight, and they would be paid, if they were paid at all, in other ways, such as plunder. Armies were also difficult to supply, so you couldn't keep them in the field for too long. On to fighting. Large battles were risky and costly for the leaders, and so they were therefore rare. If your understanding of most medieval battles is based upon a famous one like at Hastings, well, let's remember that Harold Godwinson was killed at Hastings. That's a very risky undertaking. If you can avoid a battle and avoid that risk to yourself and to your army, you more than likely would. This comes on to the second point. Siege warfare was very common. If you could surround an enemy and put them in a hopeless position, perhaps by surrounding them in a town, or forcing them into an unfavourable position, or even surrounding them in a castle, and then forcing them to surrender because of the hopelessness of that position, or because they were running out of supplies, then that was much better than committing thousands of men at a time into a very risky and bloody battle. Sieges were really more common than battles. Lastly, if it did come to a fight, the rich were in a better position than the poor. Rich warriors were often captured for ransom rather than killed. Under codes of chivalry, rich warriors would put themselves at the mercy of their captors and then would expect to have their relatives and their supporters to have to pay a handsome fine or ransom in order to get them home again. Most rich people in battles, if they were not in a hopeless position, could expect to live to see another day. Although, of course, these were very dangerous times and people were, of course, killed. How about raising armies? First of all, soldiers had feudal obligations to serve. We'll look at this in more detail later on, but basically, with a few loopholes, it was very difficult to get out of serving in the army if it was demanded of you. Armies were small by modern standards. 10 to 20,000 was usually the upper limit. Consider too that these would often have large numbers of cavalry horses with them. And link this to the item we looked at before about armies being difficult to supply. A large town at this time might have 2,000 people in it, so keeping 10 to 20,000 people on the march would have been incredibly difficult to supply with food, and they would strip the land bare as they crossed. Consider as well the supplies needed for the horses and the amount of mucking out that they would need. Keeping 10 to 20,000 men in the field was a hugely challenging undertaking at the time. Soldiers and commanders had commitments on their farms and estates, and so would rarely serve them for more than a few weeks at a time. Many tenants-in-chief were not trusting of the people who were looking after their estates while they were away, and so they were reluctant to leave them for any length of time. Lastly, bad weather and the needs of the farming calendar meant that campaigning season only lasted for the summer and early autumn months. Therefore, even if a war started, it could be expected that the fighting would not last long beyond October. Consider that the peasants in each army would be required to get back to bring in the harvest for the good of everyone, not just for themselves. That was the only option they had in order to prevent starvation. And as mentioned before, the tenants-in-chief and higher-ups in society would also want to be getting back to their estates to stop them being mismanaged. Lastly, we'll consider the effects on civilians. Well, of course, civilians suffered in war, as they always have done. But by the nature of limited warfare, many civilians would barely know the war was on. Armies that did encounter civilians, though, were often very much hated, even if they were fighting on their side. Armies on the march lived off the land and would often plunder civilian settlements that they entered, even if they were on their side. It was just the nature of things. Again, as I said, if you have a town of 2,000 people that was used to supporting just 2,000 people and an army of 20,000 turns up, you can expect all of your supplies to be exhausted within a day or two. But some civilians were killed by enemy armies. Some civilians were compelled to fight, and some civilians had property destroyed. Most, though, would have been completely remote from the experience of war, and all they would have heard about it was through songs and tales, and with the occasional check by the king's men to see if men were needed to be sent to the front. You might want to pause the video here and make any notes that you think are necessary. Remember too that you could improve this by making some links between some of these different features. For example, the fact that armies were difficult to supply, and the fact that the bad weather meant that campaigning season had to end. They're both linked to the agricultural year and when the harvest is brought in. Similarly, soldiers being rarely paid, and rich warriors being taken for ransom. That might be your only way of getting rich from war. Pause the video and then press play when you're ready to move on. Okay, I hope you've got enough detail from that because you will definitely need it later on. Let's remind ourselves of one of the concepts of medieval society, the feudal system. This is revision also for anyone who's doing the Anglo-Saxon and Norman England topic. At the top of our system we have the king. Underneath him we have the tenants-in-chief, or barons or nobility if you want to call them that. Then we have the subtenants, or the knights. And then right at the bottom we've got the vast majority, the peasantry. This is what's known as a hierarchy, where power is divided and shared by levels. So the king is at the top, the tenants-in-chief advise the king, the subtenants, they provide the military might for the king, and the peasants feed everyone and fight if it's necessary. The feudal system is a much broader thing than just looking at it from a military point of view, but we are going to be looking at it from the military point of view for the purposes of this, because it's such a crucial way in which medieval armies were raised. So how did the feudal system raise armies? I'm going to talk you through the way that the feudal system worked and the obligations that people had to different people in society. I've highlighted military aspects of this in red, and you may want to make a note of them. Firstly, the king made some of his loyal supporters into barons or tenants-in-chief. He gave them land in return for their loyalty and their advice. In return, the barons had to swear loyalty to the king and provide knights for the army in times of war. But the tenants-in-chief were given too much land to look after themselves, and so they gave some of it to their knights who would live on estates. In return, the knights promised to serve the king on behalf of the barons for 40 days of the year. The knights were not farmers. In fact, they were training to fight. So they had to allow peasants to live on their land and farm it. They also offered them protection. And yes, I do realise that that's a rather rosy way of looking at it. Some landlords were better than others in the same way that they are today. Some rents were really crippling, some peasants had more freedoms than others. But really, the peasants are the ones who have got the worst end of all of this deal. In return, the peasants farmed the land for the knights and paid taxes to live there. They might also have to fight in wars too. There was a process known as the assize of arms, whereby men from a community would be expected to provide fighting soldiers should they be called upon. It was rare for them to be able to afford weapons and armour for all of the men there, so instead they would have enough weapons and armour to equip a few volunteers within the community in order to go and fight for them, while the rest continued to work on the farms, bringing in the food. Let's see how this might work in practice. Record the ways in which the feudal system allowed medieval kings to raise armies in time of war. When you've completed this task, just unpause the video and we'll move on. Pause now. You might want to add this as a new subheading: feudal obligations. An obligation is where you are compelled or forced to do something. Feudal relates to the feudal system. I've included a diagram to remind you how this works. A crucial aspect of the recruitment in the Middle Ages was including for the rich were people's feudal obligations to the king. This is one of the principal ways that medieval armies were raised. Medieval kings rarely had a standing army. This is a permanent army that's training for war when it isn't actually fighting one. So medieval kings rarely had a standing army ready to fight at all times. How does this system differ from modern armies? Secondly, the modern army has a reserve or territorial force that is only called up if needed. In 2003, for example, the Territorial Army was sent to Iraq as part of that invasion. It's since been renamed the Army Reserve in Britain. How is this similar to medieval armies? And as an extension, what factors might make supporting a standing army in the Middle Ages virtually impossible? Review your details about limited warfare for help on this. Pause the video now, and when you've completed these tasks, press play and we'll move on. Done? Well, let's consider a couple of these questions. Most countries today have a permanent standing army. Britain, even when it's not at war, does not just get rid of its army. Its army is practicing and training for the next time it will have to fight and serving as a deterrent. This was not possible in medieval society for many reasons, partly due to the cost, partly due to the very agricultural nature of the society, and partly just because the population was so small, it was difficult to devote a sizable proportion of the population purely to fighting when there might not be a war on. Secondly, the army reserve is similar to medieval armies because it is only called up in times of war. Remember the assize of arms, and remember the duties of the knights to serve for 40 days. This might be similar to the part-time soldiers of the modern army going and training part-time as their obligation to that service. And lastly, what factors might make supporting a standing army in the Middle Ages virtually impossible? Remember the supply issues. When you're moving through the countryside, you've got to live off the land. You've got to take from farms, you've got to take from settlements and villages, and that can only go on for so long. There's more that you could add to that, but we'll move on now. What if you didn't want to fight in a medieval army? Well, for most people this simply wasn't an option, but there were a few loopholes, and we're going to discuss some of the scenarios now where that might take place. I'm going to talk you through that scenario now, and I might use some really bad voices to go with it, including my famed William the Conqueror voice, which is dreadful. So sorry about that in advance. Anyway, let's go. So we start with the king. What if the king needs an army? I need an army. I will enforce the assize of arms and compel men to serve for 40 days. Now, it would be the duty of the tenants-in-chief and the subtenants to provide such an army, particularly under the direction of the tenants-in-chief. Let's have a look at their response. I am unable or unwilling to provide men at the moment, so I will pay scutage, a tax to pay for soldiers. Scutage comes from the Latin scutum, meaning shield. It's often referred to as shield money. It basically works as a tax if you don't want to provide soldiers at that time that the king can use in another way. Here's how. Then I will use the scutage shield money to hire mercenaries to fight for me. They fight for pay and not because of feudal obligations. Mercenaries might be considered the first professional soldiers. They would train to fight because not only their lives depended upon it, but because their livelihoods did as well. They were often very skilled, but also very expensive, and so the scutage tax would be very steep in order to pay for the mercenaries. Do we peasants get any choice? Well, what do you think? No, you must fight if we command it. No, I thought that might be the case. Unfortunately for the peasants, they didn't have many rights at all. This was often done under the pretense that they relied on the protection of the king and their subtenants and knights in order to protect them from other dangers. But really, this is just a case of great inequality at this time and a real symptom of the hierarchy of the feudal system. So your tasks. Explain the meanings of the terms assize of arms, scutage and mercenaries. Remember that you can use other sources to look up these definitions if you're unsure. Secondly, explain why this system provided some flexibility in how armies were raised. What we mean by that is there was more than one way that the king could raise an army. Think about the different levels of the feudal system and also the other reserves of soldiers that he could draw upon. And thirdly, as an extension, why might the king provide the option of paying scutage? There are very practical reasons for this. Pause the video now and press play when you're ready to move on. Done? Alright, so the assize of arms is the system whereby people were expected to serve for military service for 40 days. So this was for the sub-knights and the subtenants as well, but also for ordinary people and peasants, they were expected to provide fighting men for the army for the assize of arms as well. Scutage is a tax to pay for soldiers should someone be unable to provide soldiers, and mercenaries were soldiers who fought for pay. This system provided some flexibility because the king might not be able to raise an army in as quick enough of a time that he wanted to, or it's possible that he wouldn't have had soldiers straight to hand in the geographical location that he was based in. For the third part of this, why might they provide the option of paying scutage? Well, remember, some people simply wouldn't have been able to provide soldiers even if they wanted to. Perhaps they had suffered losses in earlier battles. Perhaps the particular time of the year meant that the people that they otherwise would have provided would not be able to leave their estates. Lastly, it was a question of loyalty. Tenants-in-chief valued their positions and they did not want to show disloyalty to the king. So, if they were genuinely unable to provide soldiers, they could still show that loyalty by financial support rather than having to send soldiers. Everyone was a winner that way, except for maybe the peasants. Let's move on. We're going to now apply our knowledge to an exam question. Describe 2 features of how armies were raised and organised in 13th century Europe. A 4-mark question. Or if you prefer, describe 2 features of limited medieval warfare. Also 4 marks. This is about the most basic type of question that you can get in paper 1 of the Edexcel exam. You should not be spending very long answering these. Indeed, on the paper, it's even laid out with the headings Feature 1 and Feature 2, with only a couple of lines under each one, as a bit of a hint as to how much you ought to be writing. You will only have around 6 minutes to answer this question. I would urge you to try both of them, or you can just try one and see how you get on with it to begin with. 6 minutes to answer one question, or 12 minutes to answer both. It's up to you. Can you remember how to answer this style of question? No? Well, if you're unfamiliar with it, all you need to do is give 2 relevant examples and then add more detail or a piece of explanation to each one. It is possible to get full marks for one of these questions from 4 developed sentences. So don't write too much for this, and certainly don't spend too long on it. You will need that time for the 16-mark and 12-mark answers later in the paper. Have a go now, pause the video, and once your time is up, we'll move on and have a look at some examples. Pause now. How did you get on? Hopefully you didn't write too much. Let's have a look at how you might have answered them. Describe 2 features of how armies were raised and organised in 13th century Europe. 4 marks. One feature of how armies were raised was the feudal system. This involved knights being required to provide the king with 40 days military service in a year. Notice here I've given the example of the feudal system and then added a bit of extra detail. That's 2 marks so far. Another feature was scutage. That's my 3rd mark. This was money paid by a rich person if they didn't want to fight in a war. The money was often spent hiring mercenaries. And the extra explanation gets me my 4th mark. 4 out of 4. How did you get on? Improve your answer now, or if you're ready, let's move on to the next question. Describe 2 features of limited medieval warfare. 4 marks as well. One feature that made 13th century warfare limited was the emphasis on sieges. In a siege, an enemy was likely to give up when their position became hopeless rather than face an attack. That's 2 marks so far. I get 1 mark for the example of sieges and my extra mark for the extra explanation as to how sieges worked. Another feature of limited warfare was the size of arms. As men could only be forced to serve for 40 days at a time, campaigns tended to be short and limited in their duration. I don't know how that extra A crept in there. Must have been a typo. Even teachers make them sometimes. Anyway, that's 4 marks out of 4 as well. Make any necessary adjustments to your own answer, and when you're ready, we'll move on. Hopefully you didn't find that too difficult. Our final summary is going to be against the clock. I'll be using my stopwatch for this, and I'll tell you how much time you've got left. For this bit, please don't use your notes, just go on what you can remember. Define a definition for limited warfare. A definition for limited warfare is 30 seconds. Go. "20 seconds left. "10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right, we'll move on. Example. A specific example of 13th century warfare is, only 15 seconds for this, go. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1. And lastly, word. A word that sums up 13th century warfare is, and only 5 seconds for this, go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And that brings us to the end. Hopefully you've got a good introduction to how medieval warfare worked, how their armies were raised, and you've even had a small go at some basic exam questions. I hope that you found this useful. If you have, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and there'll be more content soon. Thanks very much, and goodbye.